Howdy, Pima Aztecs. Welcome to my lair. I wore this t-shirt just for the skeletal system. Get it? I found this humorous. It's hilarious. But what's more hilarious is watching this movie on YouTube. Okay, I watched this movie on television when I was a little kid. It was an actual movie, like back in the olden days, and you know how they show old movies on TV. And I saw this when I was a little kid, and it's really cool because the skeletons are warriors, and they're fighting against these Greek guys. I think they're Greek guys. But I remember even as a little kid thinking, how can these skeletons move if there's no muscles attached to the bone? So anyway, it's really stupid movie, but it's kind of retro cool. Check it out. Okay, so skeletal system. You can't talk about the skeletal system unless you also talk about some other things besides skeleton. And in this slide, we'll talk about cartilage. So in the cartoon, it shows here in this light blue, shows where all this type of cartilage called hyaline cartilage is located. So you can see it's here in your finger joints, your wrist, your elbow, shoulder, attaching bone to bone here in the thoracic cage. Some here in your nose. And then, of course, excuse me, down here in your feet and in your hip joints. Excuse me. The other type of cartilage is elastic, and that's in green. So think of a rubber band. So in the olden days, we used to call them elastic bands, but it's elastic, so it's resilient. It bounces back. Do that to your ear and see how it bounces back. Okay. And then fibrocartilage. So you can see the fibrocartilage is here in your knee joints. And then see between your vertebral discs, or sorry, between your vertebra, within the vertebral disc is a fibrocartilage. If you ever get a test question about cartilage and you don't know what type of cartilage it is, I think like a really good guess, it gives you better than 90% chance of getting it right, would be to say that cartilage is hyaline cartilage. So 3 types of cartilage. The first one, hyaline cartilage, is the most abundant. So it's cartilage, but it's got different things in it, like collagen fibers. I think we've all heard of collagen because I think they try to sell you hand lotion and things like that by telling you it has collagen in it to strengthen your skin. And I did some research on collagen fibers in grad school, and I can't remember. There's a whole bunch of different types. I don't know if there's like 17 different collagen fibers now. I'm not sure. But there's a lot of different types of collagen fibers. Hyaline cartilage, so it contains collagen fibers only. So there's no other types of fibers. For example, there's no elastic fibers in hyaline cartilage. There's only collagen fibers in hyaline cartilage. What does it do? It gives you support, allows you to be flexible and resilient. So resilient just means you don't break down, or you're resistant to breaking down. Hyaline cartilage covers articular surfaces. So articular just means joint. So the surfaces of bones where you form a joint, you'll find hyaline cartilage. So for example, check it out, the elbow joint. So between the humerus and the radius and the ulna, you'll find hyaline cartilage at that joint. Costal cartilage here, like we showed that earlier, between the bones of the thoracic cage and the sternum. You'll find hyaline cartilage in the lungs. So your lungs are basically a series of tubes. Keep those tubes open, you use hyaline cartilage. And then also you can find hyaline cartilage in your nasal area here. Elastic cartilage, it's less abundant than hyaline. It contains collagen fibers and elastic fibers, and we talked about that, why make your ear bounce back. So you find that in your external ear and your epiglottis. So the epiglottis is that elastic cartilage that covers your glottis. So epi means on top, glottis, I can't remember if it's Greek or Latin. But anyway, so on top of the glottis, where do you find the glottis? You find the glottis in the trachea. So the epiglottis covers the opening to the trachea, so when you swallow, the food goes down your esophagus and not your trachea. And then the third type of cartilage is called fibrocartilage, and fibrocartilage contains really thick collagen fibers. It has great tensile strength. Tensile strength just means it has the ability to resist being pulled apart. So if you tried to pull that cartilage apart, it would be hard to do because that cartilage has great tensile strength. And you find that in the meniscus of the knee. So you've probably heard people say, oh, my meniscus is torn. Well, that meniscus in the knee that's the name of the structure, the meniscus. But what is it made of? Fibrocartilage. And then also you find fibrocartilage in the vertebral discs between the vertebrae of the spinal column. And here's a cartoon that just kind of puts it all together. This shows, actually, here's the epiglottis. Remember, it's that piece of cartilage that moves over the glottis, and the glottis is in the trachea. So cartilage that's associated with the skeleton has no blood vessels and no nerves. So if you are cartilage and you are associated with the skeleton, as shown in this cartoon, you don't have any blood vessels and there's no nerves associated with you. Around the cartilage, or anything that says chondros or chondrium, that's all cartilage. So you have a piece of cartilage and you have this structure that surrounds the cartilage, or yes, actually that's a good way to say it, because peri means around. So the perichondrium surrounds the actual cartilage, and the perichondrium actually has blood vessels so that it can deliver nutrients like glucose to the cells that live in the cartilage. And that perichondrium that surrounds the cartilage is a dense connective tissue. Okay, so let's take a look at how cartilage is formed. So here's the cartoon, here's the perichondrium. We just talked about that. So this is all perichondrium. This would go on top of the cartilage, and then here would be the cartilage down here. Oftentimes cartilage in cartoons in anatomy and physiology is shown in blue or shades of blue. So in this cartoon it shows there are two types of cells actually in this cartoon. Fibroblasts, so these guys kind of look a little bit like smooth muscle cells, just in their tapered shape here. So these are fibroblasts, and they live in the perichondrium, and it shows here that they're dividing, and you can tell they're dividing because check it out. Here's one set of chromosomes that's going to go to one of the daughter cells. Here's another set of chromosomes that's going to go to the other daughter cells, the other daughter cell. All right, this is happening in the perichondrium. Fibroblasts in this layer are dividing, and what they do when they divide, the daughter cell will go on, the daughter fibroblast will go on to do this thing called cellular differentiation. In other words, to make a different cell. So these fibroblasts will differentiate through a bunch of cellular magic that we won't talk about. They'll go on to differentiate into these cartilage cells called chondrocytes. So remember, anytime you see the word cyte, that's cell, and anytime you see chondro, any form of chondro, then that is cartilage. So this is a young chondrocyte or cartilage cell, and it lives in this thing called a lacuna. So lacuna or lacunae, that's from the Latin for a little lake. So I guess to the early scientists looking at these things, this looked like a little lake, and then the chondrocyte lives in that. And then here's a more mature chondrocyte. Okay, so remember the process that we're looking at here is we're trying to see how you grow cartilage. So remember here you had a fibroblast, and then it differentiated into a young chondrocyte in a lacuna, and then you have a chondrocyte in a lacuna. And these chondrocytes secrete this thing called a matrix. So a matrix is just the thing that the cell lives in. And we'll talk a lot about what is in the matrix when we build a skeletal system, but for cartilage we'll just call it the matrix for now. Okay, so then as time moves on and you're trying to grow your cartilage, again you have up here in the perichondrium, your fibroblasts are still dividing and differentiating into young chondrocytes, and then those young chondrocytes mature into mature chondrocytes, and they make this thing called the matrix. And then as time goes on, you'll have new matrix out here, and then the older matrix that has already been made. But as you do this, I don't know if you can see this, but I don't know if I lined up these cartoons right, but the cartilage actually gets bigger. So from here, you've got this much height when you start trying to grow your cartilage, and then over time you're going to grow this much cartilage. Okay, and this type of growth has a special name. It's called appositional growth, and we'll see this again in more detail when we do the skeletal system. But appositional growth happens when these fibroblasts, they'll grow and divide in the perichondrium, then they differentiate into chondrocytes, and then they start secreting matrix into the cartilage. That's appositional growth. Okay, so we went over this already. And then the chondrocytes also do this thing called interstitial growth, where the chondrocytes will divide within the cartilage and secrete matrix, so expanding the cartilage from within. So just the appositional growth is when you're growing and dividing your fibroblasts, and then interstitial growth is when the chondrocytes are secreting the matrix, and then the matrix will increase in its thickness in all different directions in interstitial growth. And then over time the cartilage calcifies. And the calcification of cartilage occurs during your normal bone growth. So actually you're growing your bone when you start growing your bone when you're an embryo, and you grow your bone throughout your youth, and then you can't grow bones lengthwise once you get older. Once your bones have stopped growing, they'll stop growing in length, but you can still grow your bone in width. So for example, if you started powerlifting, within 6 months your bones would be thicker. All right, some functions of the skeletal system. These are pretty obvious. I think you can answer any of these questions. Why do you need a skeletal system? Support for your soft organs. You need the skeletal system to protect, for example, your brain. You need the skeletal system, they're levers, and muscle attaches to the bone, and then you can use the bones as levers for muscle action. Your bones store minerals and growth factors, and we'll look in depth into what those are. The skeletal system also does blood cell formation, and that's the cool sciencey name is hematopoiesis. You can store fat in your bone cavities. That's an energy source. And also your bones make hormones. You might not have known that, but they make this hormone called osteocalcin, and osteocalcin regulates formation of your bone. And it actually, osteocalcin protects against obesity and glucose intolerance, so therefore diabetes mellitus. Okay, so let's take a look at this flow chart. So we have connective tissue here and here. And it shows there's two types of connective tissue. There's connective tissue proper, and then there's supportive connective tissue. So with connective tissue proper, there's two subcategories. There's loose connective tissue proper and dense connective tissue proper. And then within loose connective tissue proper, you have areolar tissue, adipose, that's fat tissue, reticular or connective tissue, and hematopoietic connective tissue. Within the dense connective tissue proper, the dense connective tissue could either be irregularly arranged or it could be regularly arranged. If your dense connective tissue proper is regularly arranged, then you are a tendon, which connects muscle to bone, or a ligament, which connects bone to bone. If you are supportive connective tissue, you could be blood, you could be cartilage, and we went over the three types of cartilage: hyaline, fibrous, and elastic. Or the third type of supportive connective tissue is bone, which is the skeletal system, which is what we're focusing on. So let's look at the structure of bone. So there's some generalized structures and then on a bone, and then there's specific landmarks on each bone. So this cartoon is of a dried bone, and it's actually it's a longitudinal section of the bone. So they've kind of cut through the bone longitudinally here, and then they haven't cut in this piece here. But so you can see inside the bone. So in general, if you start broadly, this is a long bone, and long bones have one end or two ends. Each end is called an epiphysis. So epi means on top of, so epiphysis in a long bone. And then you have this middle portion called the diaphysis. So dia means through. So it goes, the diaphysis goes through the bone. And then if you look at the structures inside a living bone, oh, can you guess which bone this is? It's kind of hard to guess, but it doesn't really say. I don't think it says what it is. I could be the femur, and I'm guessing that because of this really big head here. But if you look at a living bone, long bone, I should say specifically, it's a long bone. On top of the head here is this cartilage. Now, this is interesting. Let's parse this out, but it's called articular cartilage because it's on an articulating surface, or a surface where you form a joint. So in that case, it's called articular cartilage. But if I was to ask you, what is it made of? You would say hyaline cartilage. Okay, so then if you look inside, you can see all this red stuff. This is all red bone marrow, and if you remember, I said that's where you do bone or blood cell formation, aka hematopoiesis. In this long bone, there's this thing called an epiphyseal line. So it used to be an epiphyseal plate. Here's another one. Here's another epiphyseal line. There used to be an epiphyseal plate when the bone was growing, but then when the bone was done growing in length, it became an epiphyseal line. And then you look inside the diaphysis of the bone and you find this marrow cavity. Yellow marrow. Oh, delicious yellow marrow. So I think early humans figured out that after they made a kill of an animal and they ate the meat, they could cut open the bone and eat this marrow, and it's full of cavities because it's fat. And then on top of the bone, remember there was a, well, in the cartilage, there was a covering on top of the cartilage, or that surrounded the cartilage. Well, there's the same thing on the bone. It's a covering on the bone. So peri means around, so it goes around the bone. It's the periosteum. So anytime you see osteum or osteo, anything like that, that means bone. So instead of so remember the cartilage was the perichondrium. This is the osteum, and it's just a connective tissue that covers the bone in this case. And here it shows a nutrient foramen. So a foramen is just an opening in a bone, and it's for nutrients. So that means blood vessels go in there and deliver nutrients to the cells that live inside the bone. And then if there's a periosteum, inside lining the cavities is an endosteum. So all of this lining the marrow cavity here, and even into here there's endosteum. That's the lining of the inside of the bone. And then it shows in this cartoon that there's this compact bone. So in the diaphysis where the bone is compact, it's a compact bone. And then when it kind of looks like SpongeBob, it's spongy bone. So maybe you didn't know this, but bones are organs, and they contain different types of tissues. So in a bone there's connective tissue, and remember bone is a type of connective tissue. So that's osseous. They say, remember, anything that's osteum, osseous, that's all bone. It all means bone. Bone in general contains cartilage and fibrous connective tissue. Remember, the periosteum is made of a connective tissue. Muscle tissue. So within the blood vessels that go into the bone, those blood vessels are surrounded by smooth muscle. There's nerves that go into bone. If you've ever broken a bone, like I've broken many bones, you know there's pain receptors, there's nervous tissue in there. Also within the blood vessels that line the inside of the blood vessel, just line the inside of the blood vessels, are epithelial cells, and specifically because they're inside the blood vessel, they're called, that type of epithelium is called an endothelial cell. And then there's 3 levels of structure in the bone. You can look at the gross anatomy, which is what we're looking at here in this cartoon. You can look at the microscopic anatomy, and we'll look at that, all the cool way that the bone is organized microscopically. It's really fascinating. And then the chemical level. So what's bone made of? If you thought of things like calcium, you'd be right. Okay, so let's look at hematopoietic tissue. That's where you make your blood cells. Hematopoietic tissue is tissue in the red bone marrow. So here's our cartoon. I think this would actually be this is a cartoon of a humerus, and inside the head here there is spongy bone, and within that spongy bone lives red bone marrow, and that red bone marrow is actually, it's not just a marrow, it's actually hematopoietic tissue, and that's where you make your blood cells. Okay, so we just said that red bone marrow is where red blood cells are made, and you find the red bone marrow or the hematopoietic tissue within these within the spongy bone. And now let's talk about the spongy bone in a little bit more detail. Each one of these, when the early scientists looked at this bone, they saw these kind of little flat pieces of bone, and they called them trabeculae. And trabeculae is just beam in Latin. So I guess it looked like a beam, like in the olden days, you know, like a beam of a log cabin or something. And they said, oh, these things look like beams, so we'll call them trabeculae. So they're just these little trabeculae, and they form these networks, and then within the networks you can find the red bone marrow. You can also find red bone marrow in this thing called a diploe of a flat bone. So diploe is just like a sandwich. So if you come over down here and you look at the skull and you take this little square out and you enlarge it, if this is a sandwich, here's one piece of bread. That would be specifically compact bone. Here's another piece. Here's the other piece of the bread in the sandwich. That's compact bone. And then all the good stuff here, if it's a veggie sandwich, all the bell peppers and carrots and lettuce and all that good stuff would be this stuff on the inside, which is spongy bone, but because it's in this certain arrangement called a diploe, then the spongy bone is called the diploe. And you find, well, why is that so important? Because you find red bone marrow there. Why is that important? Because that's where you make your blood cells. And then here's just some fun facts you can read through, but not on the test, it looks like. Oh, my favorite, here we go, cells, the cells of the bone tissue. So there's 5 major bone cell types. Let's look at this first one. There's an osteogenic cell. And so in the cell, the purple thing obviously is the nucleus, and then you can see these little mitochondria. This blue stuff, if you remember from when we did the cell lectures, this is endoplasmic reticulum. Here's the Golgi apparatus. And then in this cartoon, this guy is an osteoblast. So same thing. It's got a little bit different shape, but it's still got the nucleus, the ER, the Golgi, the mitochondria, and other things in there. This one is, so an osteoblast, this is a bone forming cell. So this osteoblast will secrete matrix to help make bone. Osteogenic cells will differentiate into osteoblasts so that you can keep your population of bone cells active. And then the osteocyte, this is a mature bone cell. And then this guy, this osteoclast, this breaks down bone. Now you might think, why do I want a cell that breaks down bone? Well, we'll talk about that later, but osteoclasts actually help remodel bone. So if you break your bone, for example, and you build up a bridge, like a bone bridge where the break was, but you build it up too much, the osteoclast will come in there and tear down some of that bone, so you get a nice smooth new bone. And you can see these osteoclasts. Look at all the nuclei in the osteoclasts. They're kind of cool. And then there's also this bone lining cell, and there wasn't a cartoon of that in the text. So let's look at the osteogenic stem cells. Osteogenic stem cells, obviously if they're stem cells, they're mitotically active, so they're undergoing mitosis so that they can differentiate into new bone cells. And you find them in the periosteum and the endosteum. So remember, I put this cartoon over here. So if you remember, peri means surround. So the periosteum is this connective tissue that covers the bone. And then here's the periosteum kind of peeled back. See how this is peeled? So this is all periosteum. And then this would actually be the bone underneath the periosteum. And then within this cavity here would be the endosteum. So that's where you find these osteogenic cells. Osteoblasts, like I said, are bone forming cells. And osteoblasts will secrete the matrix. And now we're going to call it the organic matrix. And it's organic because it has collagen and calcium binding proteins in it. And the matrix, the organic matrix that the osteoblast secretes, does not have minerals in it. The minerals will come along later, like calcium, will come along later to make the bone hard. So there's a lot of terminology in here. So you have your cell, that's the osteoblast. What does it make? It makes this thing called an osteoid. What is the osteoid made of? Collagen. What is the general type of matrix that the osteoblast makes? It's an organic matrix. Oh, this is just another cartoon that it shows the endosteum better, I think. So here's here's a cross section of the bone, and when we look inside, so all of this is endosteum. So see how it's lining this yellow, the marrow cavity? So here's the yellow marrow, here's the cavity, and this is all endosteum. And usually it's just one cell layer thick, so it's got those osteogenic cells in it and connective cells. Yeah, and Osteogenic, another name for an osteogenic cell is an osteoprogenitor cell. It's the same thing. And those osteoprogenitor cells, aka osteogenic cells, can differentiate or turn into osteoblasts. I told you that. But they can also differentiate into bone lining cells that make up the endosteal cell layer. Okay, now this is where we get down into some really funky stuff. Like, you've probably never seen this before unless you've had this class before. But how, like, you look at a piece of bone and you think, whoa, how boring. But it's really not. There's a lot of cool stuff in it. So let's take a look. So here is the bone, and we've got a longitudinal section through the bone, and then we enlarge that section. So this piece here, this would all be the periosteum, and then this would be the length of the bone this way, and then this would be the width of the bone this way. And look at all these cool structures in there that you get to memorize. So let's take this piece here and enlarge it over here. So you can see it looks like there's kind of these layers in a bone. So here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer. And then you get into this centerpiece. And if you've taken any biology classes, you probably know the blue tubes are usually veins, and the red tubes are usually arteries, and then the yellow tubes are usually nerves, and you would be right. And in this cartoon, what I'm pointing out here is an osteocyte in a lacuna. So remember, there were chondrocytes that lived in lacuna, and lacuna just means little lake. So here's an osteocyte. Here's a single osteocyte living in the bone, and where it lives is called a lacuna. Here's another osteocyte in a lacuna. Here's another osteocyte in a lacuna. And you can see that these osteocytes have these projections of the plasma membrane. And what they can do with those projections of the plasma membrane, or their cell membrane, is if you come down here to this cartoon, you can see that this osteocyte can communicate with this osteocyte through their little projections of their plasma membrane. Okay, we say that. Osteocytes, what do? They monitor and they maintain that bone matrix. So the bone matrix, we just talked about, the osteoblasts will make the organic matrix, which has collagen in it, and then calcium will come in and harden that matrix to make hard bone. Osteocytes, they act as stress sensors or strain sensors. And so when you're stressing and straining the bone, let's say you're powerlifting or you're doing a squat, those osteocytes can respond to that mechanical stimuli, and they can communicate with osteoblasts and osteoclasts to tell you whether you should make more bone, or you can whittle your bone down, depending on if you're powerlifting or sitting on the couch all day. Osteoclasts. So these guys are giant. They're multinucleate. We pointed that out. And they're cells for bone resorption. This is a really tricky word because in 202, when you do the kidneys, you're going to do blood reabsorption, and it sounds really close to resorption. But resorption is the term that we use for osteoclasts that break bone down. So they can secrete enzymes onto the bone and break the bone down, and then the parts of the bone that are needed in the blood, like calcium, can get into the blood system. This is just a cartoon showing how osteoclasts are made. So here's some stem cells. They all fuse together. You have a whole bunch of stem cells fused together into one osteoclast. And then you can see here they're living just beneath the periosteum. So here's the periosteum of the bone. So then this would all be bones. These little guys would be the osteocytes living in their lacunae. And then here's the giant osteoclast, and it's got these, the projections of its plasma membrane are called the ruffled border. And then you've got these lysosomes with enzymes in them that will be secreted onto the bone, and then those enzymes will break down the bone, and then the calcium in the bone that was broken down will get into the blood, and then you'll be able to do calcium homeostasis, which we'll talk about later. Okay, the structural unit of compact bone is also called lamellar bone. Again, you get two, you gotta memorize two names for one thing. Compact bone is the same thing as lamellar bone. But the structural unit, that thing that is the basic unit that you would find in a bone, is called the osteon. So in cross section you can see osteons. Here's an osteon, here's an osteon, here's an osteon. They used to be called Haversian system because some Armenian person discovered them. Here's another osteon. Here's part of an osteon, but it's cut. So all of these are osteons. And osteons run parallel to the long axis of the bone. So actually this osteon would run all the way back this way. So osteons are, you're just seeing it in cross section here, but it's actually a tube. So this whole thing would be the osteon, or tube or a cylinder. So it's kind of a, it's not really hollow, but it's a tube of bone matrix. It has cells in it, and there's stuff called ground substance. And the structures that make the osteon are these things called concentric lamellae. So there's going to be three different types of lamellae. Lamellae is just Latin for plate. So these are plates. So I guess the early scientists thought these looked like a plate. So this would be one plate. Concentric means one after the other. So here's the next plate in this osteon. Here's the next plate or concentric lamellae in that osteon. Like I said, there's more than one type of lamellae. Between the osteons, so this piece right here, interstitial, between the osteons, you find interstitial lamellae. And then see this stuff here that goes all the way around the whole bone? That's a circumferential lamellae. So here would be one plate of circumferential lamellae. Here's another, here's another, here's another, here's another. This is just another cartoon that shows the way that the long bone is built so that it's real strong. So here's these are all concentric lamellae, and they run in different directions. So this concentric lamellae is running in this direction, this one's running in this direction, and then this guy's running in this direction. So these concentric lamellae are running in different directions. That makes the bone really strong. Oh, and then in this center part here, this is called the central canal. So this is these are central canals of the osteon. And then here's concentric lamellae as well. Shows it here. And then they just pull out the next concentric plate, and they pull out the next concentric plate here to show you. So bone can the way the concentric lamellae run. You have these collagen fibers of the concentric lamellae. They run in different directions to help the bone withstand stress. So here's the central canal. We talked about that. The central canal runs through the core of the osteon. So here's an osteon. Here's the central canal running through the core. Contains blood vessels and nerves, and it runs parallel to the long axis of the compact bone. So that's the central canal. There's another canal. So these early scientists that looked at the bone saw a lot of canals and plates, apparently. So the perforating, or Volkmann's canal, here's a perforating canal, here's a perforating canal. Perforating canals just connect central canals to each other. So here's one central canal, here's another central canal, and then here's a perforating canal connecting the two central canals. And then we talked about these guys, lacunae. Those are just small cavities that contain the osteocytes. And now another term, canaliculi. So canaliculi is Latin for little canals that connect the lacunae to each other. And ultimately they go to the central canal. So let's check it out. Here's the central canal. Now let's say you are an osteocyte and you're living in a lacuna way out here in the furthest concentric lamellae. The furthest, what I mean by furthest, is you're furthest from this blood vessel that is bringing you glucose. So, and glucose cannot, its molecule, it can't diffuse by itself all the way out here to this osteocyte. But what it can do is the glucose can diffuse out of the blood vessel to this first osteocyte, and then through the canaliculi, the projections of this osteocyte can transfer the glucose, let's say, to this osteocyte, and then this osteocyte can transfer the remaining glucose to this osteocyte. Wow, what a socialist community. Look at them share. Like this osteocyte could take all the glucose and not share it, but it doesn't. Through its canaliculi, this osteocyte shares with this osteocyte, shares with this osteocyte. They all live together in harmony. Okay, so this cartoon talks about the osteoblasts and the periosteum. So here's periosteum out here. Osteoblasts and the periosteum secrete bone matrix, and they maintain contact with each other via cell projections with gap junctions. So if you, it doesn't show it. So the periosteum would be out here. So this would be the bone, right? And here's the periosteum out here, and there would be osteoblasts in there. And then the osteoblast cells, or the osteoblasts, could contact these osteocytes through these structures called gap junctions. So we talked about gap junctions when we did cells. I don't know if you remember that from the cell lectures, but gap junctions are between cells, and they allow cells to communicate with each other. So if you're an osteoblast, you're going to secrete the osteoid, and then the minerals are going to come in and make the osteoid hard, and then you get trapped in these canaliculi, or you get trapped in the lacuna, and then you become a mature cell called an osteocyte. So we talked about the different lamellae. So here's goes all the way around is the circumferential lamellae, and then the concentric lamellae are within the osteons, and then between osteons you have this interstitial lamellae. Those are just incomplete lamellae. They're not part of a complete osteon. And we said this, that the circumferential lamellae are just deep to the periosteum. So here's the periosteum cut. Here's the concentric lamellae in the cartoon. And then this cartoon just shows it all of it together and all the parts labeled so you can study it. Oh, this is really cool. I think these photographs are, well, they're actually photographs, or maybe they're micrographs, I should say. I think they're from the Saladin text, but it's pretty cool because check it out. Let's look at the main box here. So this would be a micrograph of a single osteon. So here's the osteon. Here's the central canal. Here's the osteocytes in their lacunae. Here's the canaliculi. But what it does, it takes this original picture, and then each structure that it wants you to look at, it puts in blue. So check it out. So you take this photograph. This is the same photograph. You come over here. You make only the osteons blue. Cool, huh? So there's an osteon. Here's some osteons. You can't see full osteons. Take this same picture, make only the interstitial lamella blue. So this is all interstitial. So that, remember, interstitial just means between the osteons. Take the same picture, you make only the central canals blue. There they are. I think this really becomes instructive when you take this picture and you only make the canaliculi blue. So remember, the canaliculi are these little canals that osteocytes use to poke their little plasma membranes through so that they can communicate with each other. And remember, the glucose is coming from blood vessels in here in the central canal, and that glucose has to get to this osteocyte out here, for example. So the glucose can travel through the osteocytes, and the osteocyte projections are in these little structures called canaliculi. And then same picture, you come over here and it only shows the lacunae. That's where the osteocytes live. All right, so let's look at spongy bone. So this is a photograph. This is a cross section. This is the femur. We look at this is it does. I mean, so the early scientists that looked at this said this looks like sponge, and they're right. It really does. It looks like a sponge. Here's the humerus. Here's the head of the humerus showing a photograph of the spongy bone. So spongy bone is made of small flat pieces of bone called trabeculae. Remember I told you those were Latin for little beam. The spongy bone contained irregularly arranged lamellae. There's no osteons in spongy bone. So you don't see those nice circumferential lamellae and central canals that you would see in the compact bone. And then these lines here, this purple line and this red line, these are just lines of stress. So if this is the femur, these are lines of stress on how you put stress on that femur. So this is another photograph of the bone, and here's the original photograph. And in this photograph, they color only the marrow. So this would be spongy bone. So this would be a micrograph of spongy bone here. This is all spongy bone. And then it just shows the marrow. So this is all red bone marrow, and that's where you make blood cells. And then remember the trabeculae of the spongy bone. Trabeculae is just the little beams that make up the spongy part. So this would be all the little beams in blue. The end.